Let me bring in John Brennan. He's the former CIA director and, of course, an NBC News senior national security and intelligence analyst. I also got Richard Haas with us, president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's author of the book, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens. John, I want to start with you on the sort of spycraft here. China surveils us in a number of ways. Satellites, through, we think and fear, through TikTok, things like that. What does a surveillance balloon like this get them that their other technologies do not?
Well, Chuck, I think it's unclear. Obviously, this balloon is now hovering 60,000 feet above U.S. territory. And I'm sure it has visual observation capability as well as technical collection capability. And so it's a lot closer to the Earth. And although the Chinese have pretty extensive satellite coverage in the United States, it's not 24/7 on every inch of U.S. territory. So I guess the question is whether or not there is going to be some type of additional intelligence that they can glean as a result of having this balloon. It also could be that there's no intelligence value to this, that they just are trying to see what the U.S. reaction is going to be, and to see whether or not the way we respond to it provides them some type of framework that there are some disputed areas in East Asia that along near Taiwan and China, both in terms of territorial waters and sea, airspace. And so I do think it's been prudent so far for the administration to be closely monitoring this, to acknowledge it, to confront China directly, to cancel Secretary Blinken's trip, but also not to take impulsive action in terms of shooting it down. And that's why I think what they're trying to do is make sure that China understands that this is unacceptable.
Do you think it's the issue of whether or not to shoot it down? How important is it for the United States government to know what that balloon was doing? And the reason I ask that question is it seems to me, I assume the answer is it's pretty important. And the only way to do that is we're going to have to get our hands on this thing.
Oh, I'm sure this is probably the most intensive target of intelligence collection in quite some time. And so I think a fair number of our intelligence assets are directed against it. It's very clear, as the Pentagon said this morning, that they are confident that this is a surveillance balloon and the Chinese have control of it and that it has changed course. And so I think they are collecting regularly on this. So whether or not they're ultimately going to shoot it down, if they may decide to do that, and looking at the various options there, they don't want to endanger people or facilities on the ground. But I do think that every hour that goes by, they're probably getting more intelligence, both in terms of in the air against that balloon, as well as other intelligence assets that might give them some insight into what the Chinese really have in mind here, and whether or not Xi Jinping himself was personally aware of this balloon flight prior to it. I would think that the Chinese military would have raised this with him if it was an intentional flight pattern. But I guess anything is possible in terms of what the motivation and the initiative was here.
John, I know that there's some things you can't share about sources and methods of how spycraft is done in this country. But I would like to ask in a general question, are surveillance balloons an effective tool anymore?
Generally not, because technology has advanced to such a degree. I don't know the type of sensors and the rest of the payload on this balloon. Obviously, the Chinese are very advanced technologically. Might they have been able to develop some things to be able to map the technical, the cyber environment in the areas where some of our air bases and nuclear sites are? Who knows? But again, it's only 60,000 feet above the Earth, which is a lot lower than even the lowest Chinese satellites.
So, I mean, and that's the part of this that I guess it does seem as if that it's not 100% clear what they're up to. And I guess it gets me to, don't we need to know what's on that balloon before we start changing policy and postponing further meetings?
And I think that's what the U.S. intelligence community and the U.S. military is trying to do now, trying to understand as much as possible about what's inside that balloon. And I know that they can access some of that information from a distance. Would you like to get your hands on it? Absolutely. But you can also acquire a lot of insight into its capabilities from afar, and I'm sure that's what the U.S. military and intelligence community are doing right now.
Richard Haas, this didn't happen in a vacuum, and that's, of course, why I think we're all a bit tensed up today. I mean, I had, flashbacks to my childhood and the Cold War and Soviet tit for tats. But I think about let's just take the last 12 days. Bans on TikTok. We've got a general predicting war by 2025, military bases in the Philippines. There's any number of things that have taken place in the relationship between the United States and China where you could ascribe this balloon as a provocative act, a responsive act, et cetera. What's your sense of where we are and how much of the Cold War flashbacks did you have today?
I'm on a different page here, Chuck. Let's talk about the context. China has been on a decided charm offensive for several months. They've clearly wanted to lower the temperature, improve U.S.-Chinese relations. Blinken was about to be the first Secretary of State to meet with Xi Jinping in, 6 years or so. The idea that they would use this balloon intentionally to be a provocation on the eve of this trip, possible, but it's so inconsistent with everything that is going on of late. If I were the Chinese thinking of provocations, I would think something in Taiwan would be a much more obvious place to do it. This doesn't seem to me at all obvious. Indeed, I would raise fundamental questions of two things. What was the intentionality here?
Yeah.
Was it to fly this balloon at this altitude at this time? And then the decision making. All I'll say is it does not fit into the larger pattern of Chinese diplomacy of the last few months.
Well, and let's go further on that. It's fascinating to me that the Chinese government has admitted it's theirs. That's not something that you would expect them to do right away. And they're not being belligerent in dealing with this. What does that tell you?
Well, that reinforces my doubts that the administration is reacting correctly. I actually would have gone ahead with the Blinken visit. This is the most important critical relationship of this era of history. There are genuine reasons to be extraordinarily concerned about the trends. I'd begin with Taiwan, also the South China Sea. I've got any number of other issues. That's why you have these trips. The whole idea is to put a floor under this relationship. So I just don't see why canceling the trip makes sense. Again, I've seen the speculation online about the domestic politics of it. But again, I just wouldn't assume clear either authority behind this or intentionality. There's enough history to look at, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, where things happen that were not necessarily ordered at that point by the President of the United States.
This is why I think it's so important to actually find out what is actually been surveilled, what data are they gathering before we do this. But to go further down this road, if you're look at this from the Chinese perspective. If they didn't know it, they know now that the one thing that unites our politics these days is being tough on them.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a rare area, shall we say, of bipartisan consensus. You'd be hard-pressed to see fundamental differences between the Trump foreign policy toward China and the Biden administration towards China. But again, China several months ago, after, given the COVID problems after the 20th Party Congress, they have done a number of things, sent a number of messages to lower the temperature in U.S.-Chinese relationship. They wanted it as if they wanted to put off any crisis or confrontation, I think, for several years. So again, I just think that we've got to be very careful. And what you pointed to, the fact that the Chinese have reacted so quickly, that's fundamentally different from what happened 20 years ago when we had the aircraft incident early on in the George W. Bush's administration. The fact that they have not acted belligerently, again, they don't seem to be raising the stakes here. This, just putting out there the possibility they do recognize that they made a mistake. It was either a technology mistake or a decision-making mistake, because this does not. It's not consistent with the thrust of what we've seen coming out of Beijing.
Then do you expect them to make another gesture to try to make that clear?
It's quite possible. I think now you're going to have back channel talks to basically say, what would it take to get the Secretary of State in Beijing? And I would think there might be some kind of a statement, some kind of an action. The one thing you're not going to see are any more balloons anytime soon, if ever.
John Brennan, former head of the CIA, Richard Haas, head of the Council on Foreign Relations. Always a privilege to get the expertise of both of you. Thank you.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.